Sandra Kowalski had been smiling for 45 minutes when she stopped. The smile didn't fade gradually. It cut off. She was standing at the Family Feud podium on the evening of September 22, 2021, and the survey question on the board was, "Name something a wife worries her husband is doing when he's working late." Her family had buzzed in first. She opened her mouth to answer, and then something passed across her face that made Steve Harvey set down his cards and say, "Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on." Because what Sandra Kowalski did next, what came out of her mouth in the next 60 seconds, would become the most viewed moment in Family Feud history and would change the lives of everyone in that studio before the night was over. The Kowalski family from Cincinnati, Ohio, had arrived at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta with matching shirts, a rehearsed cheer, and the kind of energy that comes from spending weeks preparing for something you've dreamed about for years. Sandra was 42. Her husband Dennis was 46, and standing 3 feet to her right. Their daughter Becca was 19. Their son Tyler was 23, and Sandra's sister Joanne rounded out the 5. They were a tight family. The kind of family that has a group chat that's actually active, that shows up to every school event, that takes pictures at dinner. Sandra had applied to Family Feud 4 times. She had told Dennis that winning wasn't the point, the experience was the point. She said that on the drive from Cincinnati to Atlanta, and she believed it when she said it. And nobody in that studio knew what Sandra had discovered 3 weeks before the taping. 3 weeks before the taping, Sandra had found a phone. Not Dennis's regular phone. A second phone. It was in the pocket of a jacket she was taking to the dry cleaner. She had held it in her hands for a long time before she turned it on. The passcode was their wedding anniversary in reverse. She had sat down on the bathroom floor of their Cincinnati house, the bathroom with the blue tiles she had picked out herself, and she had read through 2 years of messages. She had been shaking so hard she had to put the phone down twice before she could finish. 2 years. The woman's name was Brenda. Dennis had been saying he was working late on Thursdays. He had been working late on Thursdays for 2 years. Sandra had not confronted Dennis, not immediately. She had put the phone back in the jacket pocket. She had taken the jacket to the dry cleaner. She had made dinner that night and sat across the table from her husband and watched him eat, and she had said, "How was your day?" And he had said, "Long, you know." She had said, "Yeah." And that was all. For 3 weeks, she had said nothing, because she could not figure out what came after the confrontation. Where do you go after the thing you thought was your life turns out to have a completely different architecture than what you believed? She didn't want to tell her kids. She didn't want to cancel the Family Feud trip, because Becca had been talking about it for months. She had put on the matching shirt and gotten in the car and driven 7 hours to Atlanta, and kept the smile so intact that her own sister, standing next to her all day, had no idea. But nobody in that studio knew what was about to happen when the question hit the board. Steve Harvey asked the question, "Name something a wife worries her husband is doing when he's working late." The Kowalski family buzzed in first. Sandra was the one who buzzed. She opened her mouth. And then the smile stopped. The room held its breath. What came out was not an answer to the survey. What came out was 19 months of a woman holding herself together, finally not being able to hold anymore. She said, "I know he's with someone else." Her voice didn't break on the first sentence. She said it clearly. She said it looking directly at the board, not at Dennis. The audience made a sound like air leaving a room. Dennis turned to look at her. Steve Harvey froze mid-step. Sandra said, "I found his phone 3 weeks ago. Her name is Brenda." He's been lying to me for 2 years. And then her legs gave out, and she grabbed the podium with both hands, and her shoulders moved. And she was crying in a way she clearly had not let herself cry before, because her whole body was shaking with the force of it. Steve Harvey did something unprecedented. He walked from behind the host podium, and he crossed the stage, and he stood next to Sandra Kowalski. He did not say anything immediately. He just stood there. He put his hand on her shoulder. The studio fell completely silent. 200 people. The crew had stopped moving. The camera operators looked at each other. A producer was talking quietly into a headset. Steve was not listening to the producer. He was looking at Sandra. Dennis Kowalski had taken 2 steps backward from his podium. His face had gone pale. His children, Becca and Tyler, were looking at their mother in complete stillness. Joanne, Sandra's sister, had put her hands over her face. Steve Harvey said, "Stop everything." He said it to the room, not to Sandra. He said it as a declaration. He said to a producer at the edge of the stage, "We're stopping right here." The producer put a hand up to his earpiece. Steve held up his own hand in the direction of the producer, not aggressively. Firmly, he said, "This is not a game show moment. This is a person." He turned back to Sandra and he said, "Come here." And Sandra Kowalski, who had been holding this for 3 weeks and smiling and making dinner and driving 7 hours and wearing a matching shirt, let Steve Harvey hold her by the shoulders while she cried. He said, "Let me tell you something." Sandra looked up at him. He said, "I know what it is to be in a house where you don't trust the ground under your feet. I know what it is to smile through something you haven't told anyone yet. Because I have stood where you are standing, not on this stage in my life. Before any of this, before the suits and the show and the job, I know what it is to carry something this heavy and not have anywhere to put it down." He paused, "And I want you to know that the fact that you drove 7 hours to be here for your daughter after finding out what you found out, that is not weakness. That is the definition of a mother." The studio fell completely silent again. Becca Kowalski had come around the podium. She was 19 years old, and she walked across the stage and she put her arms around her mother and she said, "Mama, I've got you." Steve Harvey stepped back to give them room. His eyes were wet. He pressed his handkerchief to his face and walked a few paces and stood with his back to the cameras for a moment, and his shoulders moved, and anyone watching could see he was not performing. But Steve wasn't done. He pulled out his phone. He said to the audience, "I'm going to make a call. This never happens during tapings. I'm making it anyway." He called his personal attorney. He said on camera, with 200 people listening, "I need you to connect Sandra Kowalski in Cincinnati, Ohio, with the best family law attorney in the state." Tonight he gave Sandra's number to the attorney over the phone. He said, "Whatever the consultation costs, that's on me." He hung up. He looked at Sandra and he said, "You are not going through this alone. Starting right now." He wasn't finished. He turned to the Kowalski family as a whole, and he said both families would receive the full prize package for the day. He said it plainly. He said it as if it were the most obvious decision that had ever been made in this building. The opposing family, the Garcias from Tampa, crossed the stage without being asked. Their mother, a woman in her 60s named Elena Garcia, walked directly to Joanne and said, "Your sister is going to be okay." Then she walked over to Sandra and took her hand and held it. What came next shocked even his own producers. Steve Harvey turned to Dennis Kowalski, who had not moved, who had been standing at his podium in what could only be described as a person waiting for a verdict. Steve walked to him. He stood close. He said, quietly but with the microphone catching every word. You have extraordinary children. That is not your doing alone. That is hers. He gestured at Sandra. Whatever you decide going forward, you look at those children and you understand what she gave this family. Dennis nodded. He didn't speak. Steve held his gaze for a long moment and then turned back to the stage. When the episode aired 8 weeks later, the clip of Sandra grabbing the podium was seen 240 million times in the first 72 hours. It trended in 24 countries. Psychologists and family therapists were invited on morning shows to discuss what they called the Sandra moment. The specific visual of a woman reaching her limit publicly and being met with human response instead of spectacle. The show received more than 60,000 messages in the week after the episode aired, most of them from women saying versions of the same thing. I saw myself. 3 months after the taping, Sandra Kowalski had filed for divorce with the attorney Steve Harvey's call had connected her to. 6 months after the taping, she had moved into a new apartment in Cincinnati with Becca, who had deferred her college semester to be with her mother. A year after the taping, Sandra had completed a counseling certification program. She had started leading a support group for women going through betrayal trauma. She called the group The Podium, named deliberately after the moment she grabbed hold of something to keep from falling and found out she could hold herself. Today, the Podium Support Network operates in 11 cities. Over 3,000 women have moved through its programs. The motto Sandra uses in every session is one Steve Harvey said to her on the stage that night. You are not going through this alone. Starting right now. She has it printed on the wall of every room where the group meets. Steve Harvey has spoken publicly about that taping once, in a radio interview where he said, I've hosted this show for years and I've had a lot of moments. But Sandra Kowalski walking into that studio carrying what she was carrying, wearing a matching shirt, smiling for her daughter, I'll remember that until I don't remember anything anymore. That was courage. The real kind. In the end, it was a survey question about working late. A question you'd find on any game show on any Tuesday night. But Sandra Kowalski had been carrying an answer to that question for 3 weeks, and when it came out, it broke something open that needed to be broken open. Not every moment of public truth destroys a person. Some of them begin one. Sandra Kowalski began the rest of her life on a game show stage in Atlanta, in front of 200 strangers, holding a podium and being held in return. If this story moved you, if you've ever seen someone hold themselves together for the people they love long past the point any person should have to, subscribe to this channel and hit the thumbs up button. Share this with someone who needs to know that breaking open in front of the right people is not the end of anything. Have you ever seen someone find their strength in a moment they expected to fall apart? Tell us your story in the comments. Ring that notification bell for more stories that remind you that the people who show up are never, ever forgotten.